It's lovely to have so many of you here in person, and welcome to everyone who's online. Thank you for being here. As a former CBC producer and journalist myself, I'm especially pleased to be a facilitator on this topic that is actually quite close to my heart and something I care about deeply. The session's called "A Media versus Autocracy." We're going to hear from two exceptional speakers, and then we'll open it up for questions and a discussion. So first, my pleasure to introduce Jeanette Ageson. Jeanette will share about how independent publishers are keeping journalism alive, and she'll help us grapple with the question of what happens when cornerstone democracy loses its funding. Jeanette is a publisher of the Tyee, an independent nonprofit reader-supported journalism organization based in BC. Highly recommend if any of you are not subscribed. The Alberta newsletter is excellent. Jeanette, thank you. For over a decade, Jeanette has worked on creating a sustainable business model for journalism and has helped grow the Tyee staff team publishing output and revenue streams. And today, Jeanette will be sharing lessons learned from 20 plus years of growing a news organization in the digital age. Next, I'd like to introduce you to Rachel Gilmore, who will actually present first today. You've likely seen one of her many excellent videos come across your screen or your feeds. Rachel's going to explore a key question today: is mainstream media failing to protect us from the rise of autocracy? Rachel's an award-winning journalist with extensive experience reporting on federal politics, human rights, disinformation, and extremism. She recently launched her own media company, Bubble Pop Media, also an excellent feed to subscribe to, which publishes daily short-form news and videos and a weekly podcast, which I quite love. She has an impressive audience of more than 500,000 followers across her social media platforms. Suspect many of you are in that mix. Please join me in welcoming Rachel and Jeanette today. Rachel, over to you.
All right, I guess I'm kicking us off, eh? Thank you so much for being here. I'm very excited to be able to yap about some of my favorite stuff to talk about with you guys, which is journalism and democracy. The first sort of point I like to make whenever I talk about this issue is just the reality that democracy is so much more fragile than we in North America. A lot of us grew up with the US doing democracy everywhere around the world. So that definitely created a linguistic link between the US and democracy in a lot of people's minds. Although if you actually look at what they do when they do democracy in other places, it's often not quite so democratic. But so I think that there's this idea, this almost hubris around our idea of democracy in places like the United States and in Canada. What I've realized is that, and I think that a lot of people who are much smarter than me have also said this before me, it's not something that you just have, it's something that you do. So in order to do democracy, there's a lot of different elements to that I'm gonna get to in a moment. But first, I wanna talk to you guys about personally the moment that I kind of broke free of my Western idea of my Western hubris of the strength of democracy in Canada. And it was actually when I watched a democracy failing in real time. That's me in Tunisia. I lived there for 2.5 months with Journalists for Human Rights, which in the grand scheme of things is like a drop in the bucket. There were lots of incredible journalists there who were doing incredible work, fighting for their democracy. And for those of you who don't really know the history of Tunisia's relationship with democracy, that's actually where the Arab Spring kicked off, was when a fruit seller actually self-immolated. And that kicked off the protests that launched a wave of democratization across North Africa. And Tunisia was sort of one of the democracies that was longest lasting out of that push that the people of Tunisia fought so hard for. When I lived there, they had already started dealing with some struggles. The President Kais Saied, he was strengthening his grip on the government there, and they were actually months away at the time I was living there from a referendum vote on opening up their constitution, which would consolidate the president's powers. In that time that I was there, I saw the president taking these increasingly autocratic actions. And it was such a fascinating and horrifying thing to live through because I didn't feel anything. Everything felt normal. And I want to be clear that a lot of that is probably because of my privilege. Like my dollar went very far in Tunisia. I was able to, I never had to worry about food. I never had to worry about anything really while I was there, which is also why it's so important to listen to the most vulnerable members of a society, because they're the canaries in the coal mine who feel that decline of democracy first. But just to put this in perspective, I would go downtown in Tunisia, in Tunis, and I would shop with my friends. And then I'd check the news, and there would be an article that the president had granted himself by decree absolute power to fire judges. And then he fired 57 of them. And then I'd go see Jurassic Park at a movie theater. You know what I mean? Like, this is what I mean. Like, you could bury your head in the sand and day to day would feel normal. I'd go for drinks with friends. We'd go to the beach. We'd go and work in newsrooms and we'd talk, and there'd be political conversations in the background. But when I'd ask my friends about it, they'd say, you know, most people are just worried about whether they can afford bread. And you can't blame them for that. I mean, it's the day-to-day struggles too that are really overwhelming, right? Then after I left, they voted to consolidate the president's powers. It was basically the nail in the coffin for the democracy that Tunisia had fought for ever since that fruit seller self-immolated. It just really struck me that I was there so close to that moment. I didn't feel it every second. It didn't feel like I was living through the decline of a democracy. It really didn't. I was going into newsrooms. It's not like there were presidential or government people coming into the newsroom being overtly, shutting down freedom of the press. But since then, there have been sweeping arrests. And it's just really horrifying to realize how much you hear the expression about being a crab in boiling water, and it's really horrifying to realize how accurate that is. And so that's why it's very clear that, this feels like a honestly very mild way of putting it, that American democracy is in danger. It's also why, as I saw Trump doing all of these autocratic actions, I wasn't lulled or placated by all these people being like, oh, come on, everything feels pretty normal. Like, there's checks and balances, because I knew that you feel like everything's normal and it's going to be okay until it's not. And by then it's too late. It's really clear that the US is barreling towards autocracy, if it's not already in many ways there. They're rounding up folks like Mahmoud Khalil, despite his lawful permanent residency because of his advocacy against Israel's genocide in Palestine. They're demanding journalists acquiesce to their demands or turn over credentials, insulting and isolating and threatening press who ask questions they don't like. They're disregarding court rulings. You guys don't need me to tell you all this. I'm sure you follow the news. But there are so many ways in which Donald Trump is chipping away at the foundation of the country's democracy. And that democracy is far more vulnerable than many Americans likely ever realized. All that to say, Canada needs to heed this warning, because it can happen here too. We suffer from that same hubris. Here in this province, there's a premier invoking the notwithstanding clause twice in less than a month. And that's trampling over the rights of workers and the rights of trans youth. There are similar attempts to what we've seen in the US and around the world in increasingly autocratic societies to build cults of personality on the backs of anti-science and anti-institution rhetoric. I've also been reporting on white nationalist and far-right groups for years. So I've been reporting on these groups for years, to the point that one of the leaders of what's now being described as the largest white nationalist network in Canada had my face printed on a pillow, which was very weird. As weird as these guys are, they're growing and they're getting organized. And this isn't the United States. This is here in Canada. They're teaching each other to fight, and they're strategizing about how to get their messaging into the political mainstream. If you guys want to read more on that, follow the Canadian Anti-Hate Network. They do amazing work. And we really shouldn't take for granted that, as cringe as those guys are, that they're going to fail. So if we're going to stave off the symptoms and avoid the illness that the US appears to be rapidly succumbing to, we need a strong immune system. And a massive part of that is the media, the press. We know that it is because autocrats attack it first, right? So when the Tunisian president clamped down on critics in waves of arrests in the years since I left, journalists were among those who were arbitrarily detained and prosecuted. Trump systematically attacked the press. Here in Canada, I don't know how many of you guys know the whole story about me with CTV. Pierre Poilievre's, for those of you who don't know, one of Pierre Poilievre's, the guy who was his main spokesperson until a week prior when he did this, he came after me when I got a gig fact-checking at CTV. He kind of kicked off a real storm of outrage, and CTV called me and canceled the segment, and I recorded and published it. And you can hear in the conversation, they said to me, "We just don't have the bandwidth to deal with the backlash. It's not you. You did great. We just can't deal with the backlash." You know, so that's really concerning. That was started by someone who was in Pierre Poilievre's staff. So our media ecosystem is under threat. It has cracks forming, and in order to withstand future attacks, and we have to continue to defend our democracy, in order to do that, you have to figure out how to strengthen our journalism institutions. These are sort of the main threats that I've observed about the media industry that I feel are sort of under, at least within our control, because there's also exterior threats, but these are the ones that I think are under our control that we need to address. There's the profit model. Why are executives getting bonuses during layoffs? Like, can anyone answer that question for me? What the hell is going on? Why do we allow media companies to be publicly traded entities that must prioritize shareholder profits, particularly when we know that layoffs are a great way to get a quick boost to a stock price at the cost of institutional knowledge? And in my experience, because when I was laid off from Global, I had a little birdie in the group chat who kept telling me as people were nuked out of the Slack chat. So I figured out who the other people who were laid off were. And I made a group chat and we all hopped on a call and we all started talking like, why the hell did this happen? You know, like why were we targeted? And we realized while we were talking that we had all been people who had had editorial disagreements with our editors and pushed back and been willing to have those conversations instead of just going, yep, and writing the story. And to me, I don't want to issue, like there's people at Global who do great work, but I do think that there is a trend where when management has to choose who to lay off, there's a tendency to target the more difficult employees. And in journalism, that means you're targeting the people who are more intrinsically anti-authority. And where does that leave you? And Global also, one thing that I found concerning was every month they would hold meetings. Like you'd have a one-on-one meeting with your boss on how many clicks you got, with a goal of getting 1 million clicks. It was surreal. And so those are things that are just so normalized that I really think we have to revisit. The second one is the refusal to reject bad faith backlash. Bad actors have learned that it's nearly impossible for the media, particularly with the way that we've normalized approaching journalism, to determine intent. They refuse to really interrogate that. So they developed a model for discrediting people that they disagree with. This is known colloquially as the Gamergate model. If any of you guys are familiar with it, there's a really good Deadspin article, which is the one I got up there, that you should all read because it explains it way better than I can in my time here. To really oversimplify it, they pick a target, watch them like a hawk, hold them to a ridiculous standard. And when that person, who they already hate because of what they stand for, what they're pushing for, however they view that person as dangerous to whatever they believe in, as soon as that person makes a mistake, unrelated to the reason why those targeting them dislike this person, they explode over that individual's mistake, even though they don't really care about it. We saw this with Claudine Gay at Harvard. We've seen it so many times. There's a guy named Chris Rufo at the Manhattan Institute who's just absolutely perfected this model. And the media doesn't know what to do with it because of our need to both sides things. We're not interrogating why. And this is why it's the Gamergate model, because in the Gamergate example, there was this backlash to a female video game developer. And it was really about misogyny. But the people attacking her kept saying it was about ethics in gaming journalism. If you actually looked at what they were saying, how they were moving, what they were doing, you could tell it was about misogyny. But because journalists need to both sides everything, they were vulnerable to these bad faith narratives that made it out to be a debate about ethics in gaming. And then it ends up discrediting the women who are pushing back against the misogyny issue. So it's a really successful model that I'm probably doing a bit of a poor job explaining here, but we have to learn to interrogate it so that we don't end up being used. And then the third one, which is related, is our addiction to both sidesing everything. That makes us vulnerable to what I just described. We start from a standpoint in our journalism that is lacking in trust with our audience. It's actually, I think, a bit insulting to them to say, yeah, we think that you believe that we aren't human beings, and that we can be entirely objective and entirely neutral. As journalists, we pride ourselves on objectivity and neutrality, but the fatal flaw in that is that we are human beings. I mean, even the non-humans, the AI that could replace a bunch of us journalists, has bias built into it by the coders, the humans who code the AI. We can't ever be totally objective or totally neutral. Small choices about which economist you choose to interview, the order you place quotes in a story, the adjectives you use in that story that end up on the cutting room floor, those are all subjective, and bias always creeps in there. Because objectivity is impossible, the only thing you can achieve is the perception of objectivity, the perception of neutrality. And when you are chasing a perception, you are always vulnerable to the loudest voice telling you that you've failed. And that makes us extremely vulnerable as journalists. I've got a few ideas about how we can fix this, but it's not too late. On the profit and clicks side, I honestly think that Jeanette's going to have a lot more to say about this because she's got actual experience in rethinking the profit model that is way more, it's way better than anything I could say here. But the few quick things I'll mention is that I think that we need to reject corporate ownership that prioritizes shareholders and eyeballs on ads. And it would really help that effort, and this is sort of outside of our control, but if there was some antitrust action against Google, which has a monopoly on the ad tech business, and that is a huge problem. I do think also, like, as Jeanette's going to talk about, this sort of crowdsourcing support for journalism, in my opinion, reducing executive bloat as well, seem like important aspects of rethinking this model. The next one is we have to heal our refusal to reject bad faith backlash. So we need to learn to recognize when a debate isn't actually about the topics that are being presented. Like, if it's actually an argument being made in bad faith on one side that is about something else, we need to learn to recognize that. One of the things I think we should do is teach the Gamergate model in journalism school, so that folks know that this is a technique that's used. We also need to really consider motivations, the messenger, and consider if someone is being held to an unfair standard. We've already seen it, but Zoran Mamdani is going to be held to a standard that no New York mayor has ever been held to. You'll see the Gamergate model in action with his mayoral tenure. So definitely keep an eye on that. Related to that, we got to deal with the addiction to both sidesism. This is something I think that is I could end up being wrong about maybe, but I do know that the way we're doing it right now isn't working. The idea of pretending we can be fully objective isn't working. Jeanette told me something when we were chatting that you guys strive to be fair. And I think that's a great way of putting it. For me, I also really try to prioritize transparency. And I think that a way that newsrooms can do that is they need to allow their journalists to have personalities. I think that'll also help them to combat influencers, which I'll get to in a second, but let your journalists exist online in a way where they can maybe crack a few jokes if they want to. You're not going to get a phone call from the boss because you said an opinion online. I think that having those transparent existences online can help to build trust with the audience, because you are trusting the audience to understand your bias and critically engage with the information that you're putting out with an understanding of where you're coming from. So that's what I try to do with my work, at least. I try to be clear that I am reporting from a progressive perspective. I believe that trans rights are human rights. That's not a debate for me. So we're going to that's where we're going to be approaching this work from. And as I do that, I'm trusting the audience to recognize that that means that I'm going to prioritize the economist who also believes trans rights are human rights. I'm going to prioritize, those are the kinds of voices that you're going to hear from. And if there is a fair critique, I'm also going to try to platform that, but I'm not going to platform a bad faith critique about puberty blockers or something when I know it's bullshit. So, and I think that by being transparent in that way, if someone knows that's where I'm coming from, they can consume my work and then go and seek out another perspective because they know what they're getting from me. So if they want something else, they can go get that too and round out their knowledge in that way. I just think that's more honest and more, it's just a better way of engaging. And then this is the last one, but I really do think we need to meet our audience where they're at. This is obviously a tough one, and it's problematic in some ways because it yields some control to these digital giants in the sense that you're existing in these spaces that are controlled by these really messed up dudes. It's not perfect, but the reality is right now, this is where people are choosing to scroll, and it's where they're consuming information. So by choosing not to exist on these platforms in the same way as the most popular kinds of creators, and I'm not just talking about taking a show and plopping it on TikTok, like you have to actually exist in these spaces in the ways that people exist in these spaces. Like the way that I do a TikTok video is not the way that I would sit at an anchor desk and communicate the news. You have to adapt because people are not gonna watch your work if it pulls them out of, the way that they're used to scrolling and consuming information. So what we need is more journalists. And that's another trick here is that I know there's the meta news ban, but you can get around that by having individual journalists posting videos. It doesn't have to be your news organization. I really think that we have to exist in these spaces. We can't be precious about it because it's our responsibility to communicate to the public. And in order to communicate with them, you have to actually be where they're consuming information. And also you have to show a little personality or no one's gonna watch your shit. So overall, we can learn from the United States mistakes. And my answers here might be wrong, but I'm asking these questions and opening up these conversations because I think we need to have them. What we're doing right now isn't sufficient, it's not working, and we've seen in the United States how it failed them. So we have to have these conversations, and asking these questions about the future of journalism and trying different things is how you do democracy. Because it is much harder to fight off a virus if your immune system is struggling, and we need to work together and strengthen that immune system by having these conversations. And that's all. Thank you so much.
So as you heard in the introduction, I'm the publisher of the Tyee. That's a weird job title and no one really knows what it means. In short, I take care of the financial and operational health of the Tyee. And I've been working to evolve how the Tyee operates since I arrived there about 11 years ago, and it's been a very interesting ride. I put this slide up because I just realized last year that my experience in publishing goes way back to my first gig ever. So this is a picture of me on my paper route with my friend Brianne delivering the North Shore News in North Vancouver. I think that was my first gig. That was my first paying job. And I think I had to sign my checks over to my mom because I didn't have a bank account at that time. But I was very pleased with myself, even though I have a very nonplussed expression on my face. But yes, it's been a full circle moment ending up in publishing. The prompt for this talk was sort of whether or not, and maybe why, mainstream media is failing in its role to be a protector and upholder of democracy. And I'm very, very interested in the history of media and the evolution of it, and specifically how it's tied to money and the business model that underlies the production of news. I think is very, very linked. So I wanted to talk a bit about that. I mean, I won't be able to go into the entire history and all the intricacies, so I'm going to do a very high-level view as I see it. So I was thinking about where this idea came from, that journalism is sort of an upholder of democracy. It's not a regulated profession. There are no sort of sanctions on a news organization if it doesn't meet certain standards. Now there's something called Qualified Canadian Journalism Organization that comes with some tax funding, but that is very, very new. So there is actually no legal or even professional associations that uphold a certain standard of what journalism must do. We are regulated by laws like libel laws that punish organizations financially for publishing mistruths, but that usually only depends on someone being rich enough to hire a lawyer to sue for defamation. I was thinking about where this idea comes from, that journalism is this like cornerstone of democracy. And I was thinking about all like the movies and the stories that are made about the dogged investigative journalists and how vital they are. And I think, this is an iconic photo from the Watergate, the team that broke the Watergate story at the Washington Post. And then we also think of movies like Spotlight with the investigative unit at the Boston Globe. It's no coincidence that these stories are from the 1970s. Because this was a high watermark in the profitability of news organizations and profitability as independent corporate newsrooms that were not existing with patronage from government or sort of special interests, but they were fabulously profitable. 70s, 80s, 90s, newsrooms in the States, newsrooms in Canada, newspapers, that said, were having profit margins of upwards of 20%, sometimes 30%. Those times, owning one of these businesses was practically like a license to print money. And where did that come from? From the humble classified ad, that was one stable of revenue. I mean, I think a lot of people can remember that in order to do any kind of business in your community, you need to purchase a classified ad. And you had to pay by the word. If you wanted to hire someone for a job, find an apartment, sell a piece of furniture, anything, you were paying for that in the newspaper. Also huge full page ad, half page ad. The local newspapers often had a monopoly on this kind of advertising. They were a complete bottleneck in being able to reach the community. And it was common for newspapers at the time for 85% of their revenue to be coming from advertising. So subscriptions have been a thing always, but actually that only paid for sometimes the printing and the delivery of the paper. It never meaningfully covered the actual journalism that went into the paper. Because these newspapers were so flush with cash, large urban centers often had some competing newspapers, and so what they often competed on was prestige. And these investigative units were seen as prestige units within newspapers, but they are very, very costly. They're always cost centers and not revenue centers. And then in the late 90s, early 2000s, the internet happened. And the internet disrupting journalism was not this like natural force of nature. Of course, it was hugely disruptive, but the newspaper industry was slow to react, and they got disrupted, first by things like Craigslist, which completely took away the classified advertising. And then finally, Google and Facebook really figured out the ad game in about the mid-2000s, and then that's when the bottom fell out. And you can see this in newspaper revenues in Canada between 2004 and 2023. Daily newspaper advertising is in blue, and you can see how it's really fallen off there. And then you see what happens on the workforce. So again, choices were made. This is not a natural force of nature, but the last 20, 30 years have seen a ton of newsroom closures. So newspapers just straight closing down, or their newsrooms being gutted, journalists having to do a lot more with a lot less. A bunch of the big newspaper chains also went on a shopping spree and started buying up chains. And loaded themselves with a ton of debt. Like Post Media, for example, right now has a huge amount of debt that is held by a foreign hedge fund, and that is absolutely strangling their news operations. This is a chart of newsroom closures. The blue lines are closures, and the orange bars are new outlets that have opened in the same time period. And so what that means is that there are a lot fewer journalists on the ground, out of the office, observing things with their real eyes. This is Amanda Fall at Hosgood. This is the Tyee's Northern BC reporter. She works out of Smithers, and she spends a lot of time being out in the community, taking photos, doing interviews. She will also head out into very remote areas and will have to carry a satellite phone with her. She's incredibly brave. But she also has the time to do this. The Tyee, we allow our reporters to take a bit more time with their stories. We expect reporters to file 1 to 2 stories a week. Whereas at a lot of the newspapers that are operating these days, they're expecting multiple stories to be filed per day. And that means that often reporters can't actually leave their desk or sometimes have enough time to like make more than a couple phone calls before they file their story. This kind of reporting is extremely expensive, and so this is one of the first things that gets cut when newspapers lose their huge profit margins, when they're no longer competing on prestige, and they're just trying to survive. This is the kind of thing that the Tyee was seeking to preserve and replace. The Tyee was launched in 2003 by journalist David Beers, who was formerly chief features editor of Vancouver Sun, but before that had a long career in the States. He worked at Mother Jones magazine and the San Francisco Examiner, and was a magazine feature writer for most of the major magazines that you can think of in the States. Came to Vancouver, worked at the Vancouver Sun, and then was out of a job in about 2001. And he looked around and he goes, well, this sucks, because there's only one company owns both of the newspapers in town. So if you want to work in print media, there's not really any other places to work. But he's also from the Bay Area in California, and he went, Vancouver feels kind of similar culturally to the Bay Area, but the Bay Area has a much more vibrant news ecosystem and media ecosystem. There's lots of like small and large and some online media. The population down there felt much more well served by their media ecosystem. At the time, also, what was happening is that online publishing was becoming much more available to independent publishers. So that's around the time when open source software came around. The costs of entry were a lot lower. So that was, 2003. And so that's when he launched the Tyee. With some initial seed investment, just a couple $100,000 in the first year from Working Enterprises, which is a labor-affiliated holding company, who was the majority owner of the Tyee from 2003 to 2018. That was sort of the market opening, if you want to call it that Dave saw. He saw a lot of newspapers were cutting their investigative units, were cutting their features reporting, and that also weren't doing the reporting that the local market wanted, like in-depth investigations on environment, really thoughtful cultural coverage. So that's what we started publishing. I've been at the Tyee for about 11 years now. I joined in 2014. The Tyee has had many, many different lives. Since I've been there, I've done a complete corporate changeover of the Tyee twice. First from one private owner to another, and then from that private owner to a nonprofit society. So the Tyee has been officially nonprofit since 2022, although before that we were an unprofitable private company. So we've been spiritually nonprofit the entire time. Eventually said, let's just be who we are, and officially became a nonprofit. But it also was appropriate because about the time that I got there, the Tyee was very early to experiment with crowdfunding for journalism. So I think the first time they ran a crowdfunding campaign was in 2009, and they simply asked their readers to pitch in some money for an election reporting fund. And I think they asked for $5,000, and they got $25,000. And that was seen as incredibly strange at the time. This is before Kickstarter existed, or Indiegogo, or Patreon, or anything like that. And it was seen as so strange that the CBC called Dave, the editor, up for an interview, was asking him about this highly controversial move to ask readers for direct support and even like ask for their input on what kind of reporting they wanted to see at the election. that was very, very strange to people. And so then I was brought on in 2014, and I have a background in digital campaigning and fundraising. So we invested a lot more in the crowdfunding side of the organization. That has really made all of the difference. This is Isaac, our labor reporter. Sometimes we rope our reporters into writing thank you notes to our donors. So when I joined, the Tyee had started doing some experiments with crowdfunding, and I believe in that year they made about $100,000 that year from crowdfunding, and then we've really gone hard at it in the last 11 years, and we've actually 10x that revenue source. We have 11,000 paying members, putting in about $1.3 million a year, and that's all without a paywall. And every single year, it reinforces that this is a fantastic model to support the kind of investigative and long feature reporting that has since disappeared from many newspaper pages. It's membership, it's not subscription. So we're asking people to help build something that they want to see in the world. And we're asking people to support access for everybody. When people give to us, they keep it open for everyone else to read, which is also fantastic because it doesn't cut off our growth. So when people want to read an article on the Tyee, they're not frustrated by immediately hitting a paywall. So that's wonderful. Our reporting can go pretty far, especially when something really hits the moment. It perfectly aligns the business side and the editorial side of the newspaper. So a lot of newspapers have this struggle between the advertising side wanting more space to show their advertisements to readers, and the editorial side is saying, no, I want as many column inches as I can to showcase the journalism. But when you're supported by readers to do exactly what you are doing, it actually behooves you to do more of the journalism that then will encourage more people to be members. And it also means that you can be in a virtuous circle when you're a nonprofit, because the better we do, the more members we bring in. By our very structure, that money is guaranteed to be reinvested into hiring more journalists or making us more resilient, putting it into a reserve, making sure that we have the right insurance, that we can pay for the right lawyers who can keep us safe. So it all works together. So this is our current revenue mix. This is just from our last year's annual report, and a super exciting annual report financials. It's my favorite part. As you can see here, 50% of our revenue comes from reader contributions. People give on average between like $10 and $15 a month. Currently about 11,000 people support us. Just 5% come from advertising and other things, like we rent out a couple hot desks in our office. So we do have advertising, but it is actually a very, very small, like almost diminishing amount of our budget. So this new model of nonprofit journalism is actually they're almost different businesses altogether from what used to sustain journalism. And we've won some awards. This model it allows us to stay very, very focused on our most high impact work. And that often comes with recognition. Awards they might be vanity projects. They can be a bit superficial, but we also see them as markers of credibility, showing that our model of independent journalism produces same or better quality and standard of work than the majors like Globe and Mail, Toronto Star. We often beat them in categories that we are competing in. So it might be a little bit vain, but I also think it's an important marker that the quality of journalism that is coming out of these shops is comparable or better. And this is our team, and this is only some of them. So we're up to a staff of 25 people right now. We're expanding little bit by little every year. We've started doing some Alberta reporting. We have an Alberta newsletter called the Alberta Edge. If our digital marketing is working properly, if you go to our website, you should get a pop-up form inviting you to subscribe for free to the Alberta Edge. So I encourage you to do so. Nonprofit news is very small in Canada right now. There's a new designation called Registered Journalism Organization, which makes you a qualified donee like a charity and able to give out tax receipts. There's currently only 17 registered journalism organizations in Canada, even though the designation has been around for about 6 years. But in other countries, the nonprofit news movement is much further along and much more developed. In the States, there's huge organizations and conferences all about strategizing on how to keep funding and supporting independent journalism, especially at the local level. There's nothing that exists quite like it in Canada right now. Myself and a network of other publishers are working to advance that movement in Canada, but in other parts of the world, this is not some weird thing. This is much further ahead. And I really do think that it is the future of the kind of independent journalism that we talk about when we talk about journalism supporting democracy. And that's it.
Jeanette, I'm interested in some ways you positioned yourself as a regional or local publisher. And of course, then one of the frustrations as one of your contributors is the failure to attract international and national news. And I wonder whether you have any interest in those dimensions of journalism, or whether you say, no, our strength is local and we will remain local.
Oh man, I mean, that is a next level of sort of sustainability and building back journalism capacity. Could you imagine if we had a foreign bureau? My goodness. I'm just working on building out our Alberta bureau right now. But that said, I do think that the Tyee being a regional publication is part of the reason why we have such strong reader support. I feel for a certain segment of readers, the Tyee is synonymous with the kind of British Columbia in particular that they know and that they recognize, and so they feel in community with the Tyee as part of their identity as British Columbians. So that's what I suspect. I think it is part of our success with our membership program. I see all kinds of growth in the Tyee's future. That said, though, our actual growing of the team has really only happened in the last 7 or 8 years. I talked about many different eras of the Tyee, and there have been some really shaky eras where it wasn't a sure thing that we would be able to keep going. So I'd love to see continued stability and growth for the Tyee, and having someone in a foreign bureau would be a major feather in our cap. And thank you for being a member.
My question is about what your thoughts are on public broadcasters. In the spirit of full transparency, I do love the CBC for many things. I think it's like a great Canadian cultural institution that offers more than its journalism. It goes a lot deeper than that. I was very worried that Pierre Poilievre was going to win the last election before Carney kind of came on the scene. And one of the things I was really upset about was the way that he wanted to slash and burn the CBCs. But then I'm also kind of conflicted when I see, local news desks are kind of cut. Executive bloat, as you called it, isn't. So I love the CBC, but I want to hear your opinions on it, and I want to maybe hear about what you think their role is and how we can, as a public institution, it's our CBC. Mm-hmm. So how can we imagine a better public broadcaster that serves us as the public?
I love CBC as well. I watch it all the time. When I do my makeup for my videos, I'm usually watching the National in the background. And for me, the biggest public service that the public broadcaster provides is local journalism. And that's what's so scary about it potentially being cut, is it can really contribute to the creation of news deserts. So it's funny because a lot of what I watch is their national coverage and their politics coverage. But I do really think that their first and foremost responsibility is to provide that local coverage in spaces where that's lacking. I would love to see them sort of refocus in that way instead of, doing CBC Gem and, although they should probably figure out the streaming world, but I do think that there's some misguided, it's like they're trying to compete with private corporations by behaving like one instead of actually meeting the moment with their actual mandate and what Canadians need them for.
I say thank goodness for the CBC.
Yeah,
in a lot of communities, it is the CBC or nothing. Also to do with the profit motive, that it's just straight up unprofitable or sustainable to do journalism in a lot of communities, but they still need it. I think we should vigorously defend it because you wouldn't be able to start it. It's part of a different era of civic thought and the ability to institute public institutions like that. So I think any ground that is lost with the CBC would be very hard to recover.
I'm really upset, especially with the US media, how they normalize Donald Trump. And is it because they hold the position of the president in such high esteem? Because he should be completely lambasted or not publicized at all for the stuff he does. Why are really bizarre things being normalized now?
There's a lot of different reasons for that. You know, a lot of people much smarter than me have pontificated on for a really long time. I mean, even if you go back to the thesis of manufacturing consent, the idea that to attain certain positions in the news world, you have to have a deference to authority and an acceptance of certain narratives to be able to get into those spaces in those rooms. And I mean, the concerns that I have where I've lived through newsrooms not really liking an anti-authority sentiment in their journalists, then creates a condition where you have a room full of reporters standing there who are so scared of losing their access that when Donald Trump says, "Quiet, piggy," they don't say anything to defend their colleague. You know, if every single journalist stood up to that stuff, it would create a new condition where, you know, they would all be able to do so without fear. But the problem is there's also those weirdo quisling journalists that are, you know, fake news people that are now just filling the void as well. I do think it's really important to cover Donald Trump, and because of the ways that you have to expose his authoritarian bent. But I also do think that there's a way of doing that responsibly and a way of doing it that, as you said, normalizes him. And it's really important to not do the latter.
As progressive journalists, in the face of the comments section, I don't even know if they're real people half the time, for the right-wing people to attack progressive journalism, any kind of progressive statement. Where do we stand as people trying to defend democracy, people trying to defend the ideas and the vulnerable in the comments section, in the place where these people come to attack us at our base? I've been through your comment sections, Rachel. It's bad what some people do to you. So like, I want to know what your ideas are on that.
Well, you know what's one thing I do is on Instagram, if you want to leave a hate comment on my video, you have to follow me first. So at least I get follows out of it. And that is kind of how I approach it. I mean, I kind of took the twisted incentive model that the Zuckerbergs of the world have created, where you can come into my comment section and attack me. I do get upset when people start attacking vulnerable groups and stuff. On every platform except for Twitter, there's a sufficient community of really smart, awesome people who will kind of like just lambast that individual. I don't like deleting comments if I can avoid it, just because I want to allow people to have a discussion and I don't want to be too autocratic myself with that. But I don't care. If they're going to insult me, go ahead, because all it does is there's a Cardi B quote, if you guys know the rapper, but she once said, you know, I want to thank the haters when she was accepting an award for commenting on my stuff and blowing it up, because you guys are the ones who made me famous. And I do think that there's a degree of truth to the fact that when people leave hate comments and stuff, it allows my videos to get broader reach and reach way more people who otherwise wouldn't have seen the journalism that I'm doing. And I'm hopeful that that is a net benefit relative to the tiny mental health price. But I had years in therapy. I moved to Quebec, so I'm having to find a new therapist. But you know, overall, it's there's that element too.
Yeah, and I guess if you're asking for tactics for engaging in those kinds of communications, I don't know if that's time well spent, honestly. But I'm open-minded about it. If anyone has stories about meaningful change or changing minds or something that has happened as a result of mixing it up in the comment section, sometimes it might feel satisfying to really like nail someone. But in terms of moving things forward for a cause or caring for yourself in working towards something, personally, I think it's usually better to find what's the next step towards moving towards what you want to happen and who else can join you in that.
If I can just add on to that, the one thing I will say in defense of arguing in the comments, not that I think overall it's a great thing to fall down a rabbit hole with, but I do think that at least having there be visible pushback to hateful stuff, to vulnerable people who might be seeing the hate comments, I think that sometimes it can hopefully help them to then see that there's a whole community of people who will defend them. And I don't think you should like get into the back and forth. But one little like That's not nice.
Yeah. Oh, and I will say we maintain a comment section on the Tyee, but it's highly regulated. Like it has strict rules. We have humans that go through and look a couple times a day and delete comments and ban people at will. And if we get pushback on it, we say, our house, our rules. If you want to go somewhere else, that's fine. But yeah, we like to keep a discussion space open, but we actually have very strict rules of engagement for that. And a lot of it has to do with attacking other people, using any kind of dehumanizing language. We're pretty strict about that.
It's really interesting to hear about the model, Jeanette, of how you guys work, and kind of a two-part question.
Okay.
One, is that the same way that some of the bad faith actors work, like, say, Rebel News or outlets of that ilk? And then two, if they do, how do we protect the overall media landscape from not just becoming, I go down my rabbit hole and those guys go down their own rabbit hole? We never talk as a society.
That is so true. That the other folks that have really nailed the crowdfunding game are folks like Rebel Media.
Yeah.
They are very aggressive and timely about it too. And they mix also sort of like advocacy, activism, and mixing up with political causes with their own reporting. So they'll often sort of crusade about a certain issue, and then at the very same time, they've put up a URL that is accepting donations. They're often sort of mixing the fact that they raise money for people that are subjects of their story. That's not raising money for independent journalism. That is something else entirely. But that said, yeah, that is a thing. And that is sort of like the dark arts that you need to hold yourself back from. That's a bad instinct that you need to not indulge in, is appealing to the worst instincts of people. What I try to do, what I think we do quite well, is appeal to good instincts and appeal to sort of socially minded, positive things that we're trying to get done together. The fracturing of the media ecosystem, that is another major trend that's happening. There is no mono audience anymore. We're each having our own experiences. I think actually going out to things in person is a good trend to get back into. Being willing to meet people who are possibly outside of your bubble and being able to have good conversations with folks.
Every now and then I'll get someone who is in my comment section or something who says, you know, I'm actually pretty right wing, but I actually appreciate this video or whatever. And I appreciate that because I'm not trying to only appeal to one audience. I'm just trying to be transparent about where I'm coming from. And unfortunately, that results in sort of some people maybe fleeing before they get the chance to engage, which is something to critically interrogate about my approach to. It's honestly really hard. Like, we're living in a really fractured time. A lot of people are just kind of retreating into their little echo chambers, and social media really isn't helping with that. I honestly don't know what the answer is with how to continue talking to each other, but I do think the in-person element's really important. There's certain things I won't stand for in person either, but being able to talk to each other and see each other as human beings is a really important part of that, and not losing that by continuing to show up and be in person with each other and like hold that space and community and stuff is really important.
I have a question about your work on white supremacy. How do you get rid of white supremacists in an institution that was built to uphold the values of white supremacy and like the goals of white supremacy?
I don't know. That's like one of the biggest debates, right? Is like master's tools, like to bring down the master's house. It's like, can you just deal with these institutions from the inside, or do you have to do it from the outside? And that is like one of the things that people have argued over for like forever. So it's really hard to say.
Well, what do you think about the story that the CBC published the other day with information from the Canadian Anti-Hate Network about the event that was held in Vancouver? Do you think that is where journalism comes in? Do you think that is an effective means of sort of rooting out a white supremacy? So if folks didn't see, there was an event, a book launch that was held at a hall, Scottish Cultural Centre in Vancouver. It was cover for a white supremacist event. Yeah. Canadian Anti-Hate Network had some information about it, worked with the CBC to do investigation, and they identified a lot of these folks and published their photos, published their names, talked about the businesses that they own, and the reaction was extremely swift. Yeah. What do you think about?
Okay, so one thing, because I'm salty and I really find this important, just so you know, the Canadian Anti-Hate Network, despite CBC trying to take credit for it, they uncovered 18 of the 20 people. And then CBC, with their bigger team with more resources, came in, looked at the work that was done by 2 women. they barely mentioned the Canadian Anti-Hate Network in their national piece, and that sucked. So you should all support the Canadian Anti-Hate Network. But also I am glad that CBC is starting to do that work, and they are starting to report on these groups. And I do think that covering them, the expression sunlight is the best disinfectant, there's a reason these guys cover their faces when they go to these events, because they know that white supremacy and white nationalism hasn't been normalized to a degree that you can have these views in Canada and like still be generally in most spaces socially accepted, I hope. I do think it's really important to expose these guys, and that's a big part of it. But in terms of like the structural racism of institutions and stuff, that's where things get a little more hairy. I think that's kind of what I was picking up on from your question, was more so about the institutional, like there's so many laws like the Indian Act, and there's things in our country that are like quite racist inherently, and those are more difficult to kind of unlearn and dismantle and require much bigger work and conversations. So it's a toughie. I wish I knew the answer to that.
My question was sort of asked. It was about how we deal with the fact that we have so much disinformation and misinformation, and that fracturing and that piece and the proliferation of Rebel News and Fox and all those folks. So mostly I just want to say, because you already spoke to this, thank you for your efforts to amplify that message, to get out to people, to connect with people, and happy to be a supporter of Tyee and looking forward to checking out Bubble Pop. So thanks for the work you're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We just have about 3 minutes left, so how about we take the last two, maybe if there's a third question, and then we'll let you handle them together, and then we can wrap up. Okay, go ahead.
The thing that struck me the most was your quotation, Rachel. Democracy is not something you have, it's something you do. And I hope everyone understands what that means and does democracy. My question is, you talked about immunizing Canada's system against losing democracy. I totally understand that analogy. My question is, what do we do with the anti-vaxxers?
I love that you're like rocking with my metaphor here, with my analogy.
Again, thank you so much. I really enjoyed your talk. But my question kind of falls back on the fact that I think growing up, like, people never wanted to talk about politics, and it was such a taboo subject. We never really like got to engage in conversations, and now when you try to bring it up, you can like sense the discomfort that people feel with it. So how do we overcome that barrier and start talking and start to immunize ourselves against all of these threats?
Yeah, I just want to say thanks so much to Jeanette in particular. I'm sorry, I don't know Rachel's work that well, but originally a BC boy from the West Kootenays myself. Yeah. But I'm really happy to see your coverage on Alberta, especially people like Andrew Nikiforuk and David Klimenhaga. So I just wanted to thank you. Maybe this is too late for this question, but I'm wondering what the threats are to not-for-profit organizations like yours. I mean, do you have people trying to sue you regularly, trying to pay you billions of dollars to buy you out?
Thank you.
Okay, what do we do with the anti-vaxxers for our democracy? I think that the anti-vaxxers in the fight to inoculate our institutions against the rise of autocracy in many ways are, the disinformers, the people who are setting aside others' rights in the pursuit of power, and all of these trends. And I think it's a tough thing because it's really like, how do we fight autocracy? And it's such a big question. But the one thing that I do come back to with this is I think any big problem, you got to break it down into steps, right? And break it down into like many hands makes light work and all that. What I always come back to here is look to your communities and your workplaces and where you have a role, because we all do in democracies, and interrogate the areas where you might be falling short in having those discussions and what you can do to address these issues, like whether it's helping reestablish trust in institutions, by being better communicators, making sure that vulnerable communities know that you have their back. There's so many different things, advocating for certain policies or politics that help to strengthen protections for judicial independence. Like Doug Ford was doing some weird speculation about electing judges. We got to shut that shit down the second it happens. The degradation of public institutions. We were talking about healthcare workers here to try to like swoop in with privatization. We got to fight back on that. So it's like there's so many different fights, but if we all have things that we're passionate about and communities that we're in, if we all take the time to interrogate our roles within that, and we all really do it, and I know that sounds maybe dumb, but we all have that role. And there's a lot of people who might be apathetic right now or feel as though their job doesn't have anything to do with democracy. But I promise you, there's some way that it does. So all of us need to think about the roles that we can play there. And I think that's how you deal with the anti-vaxxers, is you end up with antibodies that are so strong that we have herd immunity, as a result of sufficient vaccination, that a few anti-vaxxers can't kill you. Is that, yeah? and then on the second one, how do we have political conversations? It's a tough one, because last night I ran into a Danielle Smith staffer and I told her she has blood on her hands, so.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I always get that one right. But there are a few things that I find helpful, particularly with the people who you were talking about, like who just feel uncomfortable talking about it. So it's not that they're particularly like zealots in one way or another. It's that they genuinely just don't know where to start. Or they feel uncomfortable when you bring it up. A lot of people think that the barrier to entry for speaking about politics and caring about politics requires like some level of procedural knowledge of like how politics works and all of these really complex things that we don't necessarily do a great job of teaching in schools. Helping people to feel comfortable and not making them feel stupid, and just really like speaking to them as humans and making sure you're not using jargon and making sure that you're making things accessible is really important. Because the thing I always come up against when people are uncomfortable talking about politics is them saying, oh, I just don't really know enough, so I don't feel like I should talk about it. And it's not that I think that you should speak from a place of ignorance, but I do think that you shouldn't feel as though you can't be a participant in these conversations at all just because you might not be as familiar with an issue. Like, you have to let people feel comfortable coming into a space and like having opinions and forming those opinions for them to become politically involved in the first place. So I think that that's really important.
So threats to journalism, any threats that Tyee is facing, legal threats, sure. We get legal letters. The higher stakes the story, the more quickly the letters come, whether or not they have any merit or not. We've gotten quite adept at understanding what is a legitimate threat and what is not. If you're dealing and if you're calling out or doing anything that will damage the reputation to very powerful people, they will often send a scary lawyer letter and think that that will be enough to intimidate you to take a story down. This is why I do think that having organizations and institutions is important to practice journalism, so that you have the resources and the infrastructure to withstand those things. So we have extremely experienced editors who've been in this game for decades, who understand the law, they understand the responsible journalism defense, they understand what you must do if you have made a mistake and you've gotten something wrong. We have processes to do that. We also have a fantastic lawyer that we work with on a pro bono basis. He often reviews stories before we publish them, especially high-stakes stories. So before stories even get published, they've had a review, and we've absolutely checked every single claim that is in there. And if we have got something wrong, if you take swift action to make it right, that's the responsible journalism defense. You can protect yourself from litigation, but that doesn't stop people from sending you scary letters. But it takes a keen eye to understand what's a legitimate letter or not. That's why it's also really important that we have libel insurance, such that if we did have to go to court, it wouldn't financially ruin us. So having good insurance, a team, including a lawyer, very important. Do we have people coming with bags of money trying to buy us out? No. I mean, I'll take a meeting. No, I'm just kidding. Hasn't really happened. Actually more, but you'll find is in the olden days of media where huge advertisers with huge budgets that would be big annual clients of a newspaper would often try to swing their weight around in that way to try to prevent stories or kill stories. And you also see it in the orientation that a lot of newspapers have, like in Vancouver, a lot of the newspapers that have been supported by the development industry and condo industry are very unlikely to be critical of that industry, so it's subtle. But no, that typically doesn't happen with us. If we do engage with a larger funder, we absolutely know that our credibility and our relationship with our members is the most important thing. So again, money creates different incentives. Your structure creates different incentives. I'm very careful and mindful not to do anything that will threaten that relationship that we have with our members and readers. So if we do work with larger funders, we spend a lot of time understanding that we share values and that they understand that the independence of our newsroom is of utmost importance, and we sign an MOU and contract that has an independence clause built in. BC has better anti-SLAPP laws than Alberta has, from what I understand. We've heard from journalists publishing in Alberta that they're less likely to go forward with a very true story because they're less protected in Alberta than they are in BC for anti-SLAPP laws.
Thank you all for being here. Please join me in giving them a warm round of applause.